Good afternoon, everyone. We will be getting started momentarily. A few more people joining us. In the meantime, we ask that you would feel free to turn your cameras off at this time. All right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to NTI's training on Race Matters, addressing racial bias in transracial transcultural adoption. During our session today, all mics will be muted and all screens should be turned off. Please feel free to submit any questions in the chat box. We will respond to your questions during the session if possible, and if not, we will send out an email afterwards. All participants will receive a copy of the presentation and access to the recording via our NTI website. And now I will turn it over to our presenters for today, Ms. Edna Davis-Brown and Ms. Lisa Maynard. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Stephanie. Hopefully everyone can hear me clearly. Greetings, everyone, and welcome to Race Matters, addressing racial bias in transracial transcultural adoption. I'm Edna Davis-Brown, implementation specialist with the Center for Adoption Support and Education. My co-presenter today is Lisa Maynard. She's also an implementation specialist with NTI. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are going to focus on how supervisors can support their staff in building adoption competency and strengthen their knowledge and skills around race, ethnicity, culture, class, and diversity, how it may impact the child's experience of adoption and guardianship and the mental health issues that may occur. This session will also highlight modules that will specifically focus on professionals' understanding of race and racial equity within child welfare. We are so thrilled to see so many people that have joined us today because there's so many of you. Everyone, of course, will be muted or has been muted. Again, please drop your comments or questions in the chat box. We'll get to as many of them as we can during the webinar. But of course, following the webinar, we'll send an email responding to any questions, concerns that we are unable to address here. So right now, we're going to take a poll. We're pretty sure that we have participants from all over the United States. Let's get an idea of where you all live or work. Please respond to the poll that Stephanie will be putting up on the screen. So if you take a moment and just let us know what region of the United States you live or work, and if you're in a territory, please indicate that as well. Okay, great. I think we can end the poll, Stephanie, and let's see what we have. All right, we have a number of people from across the country, quite a number from the Midwest and the Southeast, and 3 of you are from the U.S. territories, and 1 other, or 3 others. I'd like you to put in the chat box, especially those other. Let us know where you're from, because I'd be interested in finding out more about that. Great. There's a lot of diversity across the United States and territories and others. Thank you for participating in that poll. Now, no doubt we have great diversity in the roles you play in child welfare and mental health. So please respond to the next poll. Stephanie, if you can set that up, choosing what best describes your current role. And if you use the other category, feel free to type that in the chat box if you'd like. So we give you a few seconds to complete that poll as well. Great. I know you're still putting in information, but to sort of capture what we have here, quite a number of social workers, case managers, we have supervisors, and a few in the other category, so feel free to put in that as well. And I see some of you are putting in information from the chat box. But quite a few of you are, about 32% are social workers. So diversity within our audience. Thanks again for responding to that poll. We really appreciate your participation in that. So next slide. What we'll cover today is we'll talk about NTI a little bit and what it's designed to do, which is to increase competency of mental health professionals in public, private, or individual practice in meeting the mental health and developmental needs of this population. So today we're going to talk about a few things. We'll provide a brief overview of CASE and NTI. We'll talk about racial bias and racial equity, personal bias, the effect of racism in adoption, the role of the child welfare professional, your role in this process. And we'll try to answer a few questions. And of course, we mentioned that we'll hopefully respond to others and send those to you via email. So we'll get to as many of them as we can. Next slide. The Center for Adoption Support and Education is a private, nonprofit services agency envisioning that everyone touched by foster care and adoption has access to adoption competency or adoption competent support necessary to navigate this lifelong journey. CASE, essentially, or the NTI, the National Adoption Competency Mental Health Training Initiative, I'll refer to it as NTI moving forward, builds upon the firm foundation of the unique expertise and core of CASE. To learn more about CASE, its mission, its core values, etc., please visit us at www.adoptionsupport.org, which is on your screen. Through our work, we've seen a need for change in how we address the mental health needs of children. The Children's Bureau grant was an opportunity to address these gaps. So what is NTI? NTI is a five-year research initiative. And essentially, we've been fortunate enough to have additional funding added and also rollover dollars, wherein we're now really focusing on helping states and territories and national organizations implement NTI and also address transfer of learning. It is a state-of-the-art web-based training opportunity for child welfare and mental health professionals, really designed to enhance the capacity of professionals to understand and address the mental health challenges of children and youth in foster care, adoption, and guardianship. And you'll see the website there, www.adoptionsupport.org/NTI, where you can get more information. And we'll be posting web addresses throughout the training as well in the chat box. We have national advisors that include a broad range of nationally recognized experts who provided valuable guidance for the development and competency and curriculum and the dissemination of NTI training as well. Numerous partnerships were also in place to provide subject matter expertise and support for training implementation and dissemination. You can find more information about our core partners and our advisors on our website as well. Lisa.
Thank you, Edna. And hi, everyone. I'm Lisa Maynard. So for most children, adoption is a protective factor. It brings permanency, safety, and nurturing. to children who've generally been in less than adequate situations, many of whom have experienced abuse and neglect, emotional, physical, sexual, and have come from really hard places. And hopefully coming into a foster adoptive family is going to help them be more nurtured and supported. The American Academy of Pediatrics estimates that up to 80% of children and adolescents enter foster care and adoption with significant mental health needs, compared to 18 to 22% in the general population. This is a staggering statistic. And our hope is that NTI will be helpful in providing mental health and child welfare practices and policies to do better, so that we can really help kids maintain stability, attain stability, permanency, and well-being. NTI advances practice for permanency and well-being. We really aim to support children to heal from trauma and loss, provide parents with skills to parent more effectively. This is a training for child welfare and mental health professionals, but many tools are embedded in the training that can be used immediately to work with children and families. We are seeking to improve child and family well-being and increase family stability. And today's focus, as Edna mentioned, is going to be on race and diversity. NTI operates through the guiding principles that families formed through adoption and guardianship meet these issues or experience these issues. Adoption is lifelong and intergenerational. We notice this in families through the years. Loss and grief are central. Every person, every child who comes into adoption will experience loss and grief. And obviously there's loss and grief both on the birth parent side, birth family side, and the adoptive parent side in many cases. Very importantly, secure attachments can be built and rebuilt. Many years ago, people thought that once a child was experiencing attachment issues, they were not going to be able to ever attach. It's simply not true. Identity formation is much more complex in adoptive families, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. Race, ethnicity, culture, class, gender identity have a unique role, and that's really what we're going to be talking about today. So specialized training is really important when we're talking about working with kids and families in child welfare and mental health, so that we can really meet their needs appropriately. This is a real quick overview of our curriculum. We have 2 different trainings, child welfare and mental health, as we mentioned. Lots of information on our website about the curriculum. The child welfare is about 20 hours with category 2 CEUs, and the mental health curriculum is 30 hours with category 2 CEUs as well. These are our, for each credit, for each hour, you get the CEUs. The mental health curriculum has 2 modules that are in addition to the child welfare, and those really look at assessment and treatment strategies and parenting strategies. Those are the 2 additional, and it's much more clinically focused. Again, we're going to drop our website in the chat box so you can visit and see details about these issues. These are our competencies. Again, today's focus will be on race, culture, and diversity. Certainly a big topic right now, and I think we really hit a nerve, Edna. What do you say? With the just based on the number of participants we have in today's webinar, really super exceeded our expectations and our typical attendance.
Absolutely, Lisa. Thank you so much. Before we do a deeper dive into our discussion of race and diversity, let's take a look at some of the disproportionality in child welfare. So here, what some of the studies of bias in child welfare have found in terms of the following: African American children are more likely than the general child population to be represented in foster care. And of course, once there, more likely to remain in care for longer periods of time. American Indian children are less likely to be placed outside of their homes. And of course, youth of color experience longer stays in foster care and more restrictive placements than their white counterparts. So this training is certainly very timely and appropriate. Our experiences create the foundation for our biases. Everyone has them to some degree or another, and it's important to pay attention to the biases so you can consciously maintain neutrality in your work. As a child welfare professional or mental health professional, you have the obligation to acknowledge, encourage, and promote the identities of children and youth with whom you work and for whom you're making life-altering decisions. Lisa?
All right, unmute. So I love this picture. I got to tell you, this is actually me and my son. I'm an adoptive parent. I adopted my 2 children from South Korea when they were babies. This little guy, Alex, is now 33, impossibly. But really wanting to talk throughout this webinar about transracial and transcultural adoption. So we have some experience with that. Actually, and then in both of our families, we've had some experiences of this. When we talk about licensing prospective foster and adoptive families, we have to be comfortable with addressing these issues. Preconceived assumptions, implicit and explicit bias, and racism, understanding how they can affect the child and the family. And any of you who are in this position, who are in a transracial adoption family, you know, it's clear to you, right? People ask a lot of questions. There's a lot of assumptions. Family members may say things that are, you know, beyond inappropriate and just don't understand the implications to the family, let alone to, you know, the larger community. There's no hiding in a transracial adoptive family. White parents with children of color are, you know, we're out there. And so one of the things that I learned very early was I had to be an advocate and I had to have an understanding of how race matters for my kids, because there's just no hiding it. We need to ask when we're working with children and families, for white couples who say they're really open to adopting a child of a different race, what is their own understanding of racism and bias? What's the attitudes and biases of the extended family, and how might that play out in a family that's adopting transracially, transculturally? How will they help a child to connect with other children who look like they do, other families who look like they do? In my family, we had the luxury of being part of a parent group for families who had adopted transracially and transculturally. It made a huge difference in my family and my children's lives. Families considering transracial and transcultural adoption often walk in the door with some preconceived ideas. And so it's really important to address those up front. Our child will have our culture. Well, of course they will, but they also come from somewhere else and have a history. They have a family history that's really important to incorporate. No worries, they'll blend. You know, my my Asian babies did not blend in with the white community in which I lived. They really stuck out. I remember sitting at the pool when my son took swimming lessons, and all these little blonde hair, blue-eyed babies were sitting on the side of the pool, all these little 2-year-olds. And I thought, holy cow, those kids are really white. And my son is not so much. Colorblind is a good thing. We're going to talk a lot about that too. Anyone who's worked in foster care and adoption knows that all you need as love is really a huge myth that needs to be really examined examined and demythified, if you will.
We are in critical times that we want to examine closely our roles and responsibilities as child welfare or mental health professionals or workers. We are experiencing a global movement in the support of rights of Blacks and Brown people, highlighting the systemic and institutional racism that has resulted in murders as a result of police brutality and the suppression of economic and social development of Black communities in America. The display of racial biases and injustices and the climate of hate that have directly affected those we serve. We talk about Black Lives Matter. We're in the middle of a pandemic, police violence. All of these things are certainly having an impact. Issues of race, injustice, police violence. No matter how much we try to protect our children and young people, they're going to notice this. It's everywhere, especially when we look at our media. Anxiety often comes from the fear of the unknown, the unexplained. Broaching the topic of the daily news in an age-appropriate way will help kids process this information, what's happening in the world around them. What is your role as a child welfare or mental health professional in helping children and youth understand and process their feelings about current events? We need to help families acknowledge the country's distress and instill a sense of mental, emotional, and physical safety in the children. We're going to talk about racial bias and racial equity. I want to mention and reinforce again about the training, the NTI training. We're going to be focusing primarily on Module 4 during this presentation, and it's really woven throughout the training to enhance child welfare professionals' ability to better serve children and families. So I want to, again, focus on the fact that we'll be targeting Module 4. So let's talk a little bit about racial bias and racial equity. What is racial bias? Our experiences create the foundation for our biases, right? Everyone has them to some degree or the other, and it's important to pay attention to biases so that we can consciously maintain neutrality in our work. Tendency to believe that some people or ideas are better than others, that usually results in unfair treatment when we talk about biases. And then there's the implicit bias, refers to the attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, decisions in an unconscious manner. We must be aware of our own implicit biases in our work with children and families in the child welfare system. There's the tendency to believe that some people or ideas are better than others that usually result in unfair treatment. Implicit bias refers to the attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, as I mentioned previously. Environment, upbringing, and society influences our experiences. They are the byproduct of our social conditioning and create the foundation for our biases. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as we delve deeper into the actual training and some of the concepts therein. Next slide. So let's look at biases at work, how they actually operate. So what are some biases that could affect your work as a child welfare or mental health professional? Some of these might include the belief that children should maintain with their birth family no matter what. Birth parents you abuse don't deserve a chance to change. Children and youth should only be placed with parents of the same race. Children should always be placed in a more economically advantaged environment. And we've heard this one quite a bit. The apple doesn't fall too far from the tree. People from a particular culture have substance abuse issues. All of these biases can negatively impact the children and youth with whom you work and can prevent you from considering all of the possible options. Think about other biases that you might include. Write those in the chat box. We'd like to hear what your thoughts are about other biases at work. Let's talk about racial equity. And we'll check the chat box again. The terms equality and equity are often used interchangeably. However, they differ in important ways. When we talk about equality, it's typically defined as treating everyone the same, giving everyone access to the same opportunities. Equity refers to proportional representation by race, gender, class, etc., in those same opportunities. To achieve equity, policies and procedures may result in an unequal distribution of resources. So racial equity really is about applying justice and a little bit of common sense to a system that's really out of balance. And I love James Baldwin's quote here. Not everything that is safe can be changed, but nothing can be changed if it's not safe, until it's safe, actually. So I think that's a really important statement and quote. Next slide. So let's talk about personal biases. And again, we all have those. Some examples are, you like red apples and you don't like green apples. This is a personal bias. There isn't anything wrong necessarily with green apples. You just don't like them. Here's another example, and one that I've become familiar with in years past. You prefer hiring social workers from your alma mater or in your sorority. But it would be irresponsible to extend an offer of employment to that candidate based on these positive or favorable biases. Cognitive biases are referred to or defined as the tendency to think in a certain way that deviates from logical or rational thinking. It's hard for some people to admit being biased because of the negative connotation surrounding the word. However, biases are hardwired into our brains so we can make quick and efficient decisions. We've talked about race, racism, conscious and unconscious bias, and personal bias. Let's now do an exercise from the NTI training that speaks to diversity and how it exists. But before that, let's do the next slide. So, what was your experience of race while you were growing up? This could be a strategy or an activity that you can do with your staff or your team, asking that question. So in a team meeting, discuss the racial socialization experiences of your staff growing up and examples they've observed or experienced related to the 4 levels of racism. And those 4 levels are cultural, institutional, interpersonal, and internalized racism. And our Module 4 specifically addresses these levels. So when you're working with staff in this conversation, you can ask these questions. What impact have they observed from these experiences of racism? In what ways do these experiences impact families served or the families you're serving? Have the team brainstorm those strategies for addressing racism at various levels. And I'm sure that you'll get a very rich conversation about racism and their experiences. Here's another thing you can do. When you talk about negative beliefs or feelings towards a specific type of people, for example, you can have workers discuss ways to help them become more familiar with races or cultures other than their own. Talk about what resources exist in your own agencies or in the community to actually do this. Ask workers to discuss with you which clients they are most uncomfortable working with and why. And ask yourself as a supervisor, what can you do to increase their comfort in supporting diverse populations? These conversations are really important ones to have in your workplace. Now, let's talk about implicit and unconscious bias. We talked previously about bias being a prejudice in favor of or against a person, thing, group compared to another, usually in a way that's considered unfaithful or unfair. There are certain types of biases: conscious, known as explicit bias; unconscious, known as implicit bias. Again, it's important to note that biases, whether conscious or unconscious, are not limited to ethnicity or race. They can be towards a certain social group, one's age, one's gender identity, physical abilities, etc. So there's many characteristics that are subject to bias. There's a great activity that we can do to point out how expansive or limited their world is. When working in adoption, foster care, or guardianship, any aspect of permanency, you will be working with a very diverse group. And we cannot change what we cannot see. So Lisa, let's talk about cultural miscommunication.
Okay, so Edna, first I'm going to talk real quick about that activity you mentioned. How diverse is your universe? This is an activity that is in NTI's Module 4, and it's a really interesting activity to do. Edna and I did it ourselves a couple of weeks ago, and it was just kind of surprising. This activity is a strategy, as I mentioned, in NTI, and it gives you a visual representation of how expansive or surprisingly narrow your universe is. Mine was far more narrow than I anticipated. It's an activity, some of you might know this. You take multiple colored beads, you assign each bead race or ethnicity. You could also use religion if you like, but just really having different colored beads representing different people. And then you present, and you could do this in a team meeting or training. Lots of different ways to do this. You could do this with your friends. I think that could be really interesting too. Edna, I think you did it with a church group recently, didn't you? Yeah. So really interesting to take a look. So then you've got all these beads, and you've got clear plastic cups, and your cup, you take a bead and you answer these questions. You select a bead that most closely represents your own ethnicity, and you take that bead and you put it in the cup. And so on with these other questions. Select a bead that represents your significant other, one that is the ethnicity of your closest friend, your dentist or doctor, your coworkers, the people in your social circle, the people that you go to church with, the people that you socialize with, the books that you read, the movies that you see, and you go on. And you take a look at your cup. If we had time, we could do this with you all, but there are way too many of you today. But give it a try. And then you reflect on the beads in your cup. What does your cup look like? Is it filled with multicolored beads? Are they predominantly one color or another? You know, it just sort of gives you an idea of who's in your circle. And because you have this representation of who's in your circle, it really tells you something about whose perspective you're most familiar with. Are there ways that you can broaden your perspective, learn more from other people. You know, when we read the same books or listen to the same news programs or talk to the same people with same ideas as us, we really are very limited in our understanding of the world. Yeah. So we make a lot of assumptions that are based on cultural miscommunication. I think about this when I think about the work that I did in an agency and licensing foster and adoptive families, and the staff that I had. Some of the biases that they brought in that were unconscious, as Edna talked about. How neat a home is, or the people that are in the neighborhood, or, you know, who's making eye contact and not making eye contact. What's going on there? Is this are they hiding something? A lot of people would say that. Or are they just used to or in a culture where eye contact is disrespectful and they're showing respect? So how are we assuming things about people, and what does this impact? How does this impact children and families? Can we challenge our assumptions? Can we look beneath what we see, because it's our projection, and see underneath that and really learn about children and families? Have there ever been times when children on your caseload have been labeled by workers, if you work in that area? Have you ever had a time when a child was, an assumption was made about a child based on how they look when they come to school or come to church? How are these being challenged? If you're a supervisor, how are you challenging your staff's assumptions? I think it's really, really important. Are there ways that you can help to mitigate the negative impact of these assumptions? Really, what we're talking about is safety, well-being, and permanency for children and families. How can we do different? How can we do better? Let's really have some thought about that. And again, all of these questions are really woven into all of the NTI training, and specifically in this Module 4.
Thank you, Lisa. Just have to remember to unmute. Let's talk about the role of the child welfare or mental health professional in helping families address race, racial identity, racism, and bias. Next slide. So, in order for us to be comfortable as professionals, we have to accept the fact that race does indeed make a difference. We have to believe and acknowledge the fact that race impacts children, that we do live truly in a race-conscious society. Things still aren't great, and some things have not changed. The lack of change is fueling, I think, the anger and the protests across the country today. If you're a member of a dominant culture, there are still some incriminating things that are going on in society. We know that there are problems and people see race. We still know that there is a culture that's racist, and letting children know that so that they'll be comfortable to talk about it when what they are really afraid of and what they heard about the race of families that they're moving into, actually. What are the trust issues that you are going to have? How are they going to gain trust, and how are they going to test these families, you know, to see if they really can be fair and just and protective? These are really very critical questions. We have to accept for ourselves that there are parts of society where it's still not safe, and that people still do see color. So if we can accept these realities, then it makes it a little bit easier for the children to be comfortable having this discussion with us. And we have to give parents and the skills and tools to address issues of race, culture, and diversity in their family. I love this quote from Dr. Crumbly, Dr. Joseph Crumbly. Some of you are probably familiar with him. So what is the child welfare or mental health professional's role? Why it is important to pay attention to race? And how can you make a difference? So Dr. Crumbley tells us it's important to pay attention to on our own biases. Here's a quote from him. It's important that we make it safe and make the children feel comfortable in talking about race and culture. But in order for us to make them comfortable, we have to feel comfortable bringing it up. So the child's comfort level is almost going to mirror our own level of comfort. And I think it's important for us to be comfortable as professionals. We have to accept the fact that race indeed does make a difference. And he mentions that, and some things, again, have not changed. If you're a member of a dominant culture, that is the group with the most societal and political power, white privilege, there is still maybe some incriminating things that are going on in society, and letting the children know that, hey, we know that there are problems. So we know it still exists. Dr. Crumbley goes on to say, you know what the trust issues that they're going to have. And if they're going to gain trust, and how they are going to test these families, you know, to see if they really can be fair, just, and proactive. So we have to obviously accept some realities that are before us. And it will really make it easier for us to discuss this honestly and candidly with our youth and the children and the families. So again, expect to be uncomfortable as you help children and families navigate this process. Let's talk about racial identity.
Hey, Edna, if I could just interject here, the whole concept of being colorblind, I mentioned that really quickly earlier, and hopefully I said it right. Colorblind is not a good thing. We cannot be colorblind. We really do have to acknowledge that people see color, and it's really important for ourselves and our kids to know that.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Lisa, for sharing that. When we talk about racial identity and cultural identity, it's really important, more so as children grow and as they get older. During adolescence, the drive to gather information and filling in the missing pieces of one story can really be strong. And that's part of identity formation. Where did I come from? Where do I belong? Am I American, Asian, Chinese? What if I am something in addition to who I think I am, or something I've never even considered? Maybe I'm Italian, I'm Jewish, and not Hispanic. How can I know? For the adopted adolescent, openness can really make this journey a little bit easier by facilitating access to information and questions, and really answers to those questions as they seek to solidify their sense of self. When openness is not an option, having open, honest conversations about known history is vital to the children or the youth sense of self. So it's really important. Let's talk about the connection between racial identity and well-being. Dr. Crumbley again reminds us that there's an important connection between racial identity and well-being. You have to carefully look at the youth's history to understand how they view themselves, so you can help preserve their racial and ethnic and cultural identity. So in order to do that, it will help you really to make the best placement for them and choose the most appropriate treatment options when they're in need of a mental health professional. So I'd like for you to think about strategies, or what strategies do you or your staff use with children and families to address these risk factors. And feel free to provide any responses or thoughts in the chat box. What strategies do you or your staff use with children and families to address these particular risk factors? So feel free to share those as well. let's talk about some more risk factors. And Lisa mentioned the color blindness, and that really prevents honest conversations. I have to share an example. I have a sister-in-law who is German, and of course she's married to an African-American person, and they have 4 children. And she shared with me weeks ago, she said to me, Edna, you know, I'm really colorblind. But in the same tone, she talked about the struggles her children had with their own racial identity, especially as they were younger. And she called me back a couple of days later. She said, Edna, you know, I am not colorblind. I do see color. My children see color. So for me to say that, it really wasn't what I was feeling. So it took a little bit of time to really evaluate that and think about her own experiences and the experiences of now her 4 adult kids. Denial or lack of understanding about cultural ethnic heritage. We talk a lot about that in the training and how to potentially address that. Living in a community devoid of diversity. Parental lack of understanding of a Black or brown child's experience in a white world. Non-acceptance by family members, and I'm sure some of you maybe have experienced that in your situations and working with families. Blatant racism or discrimination, even within the family constellation in itself, or right within the community. These are also really big risk factors. Microaggression is a term used for brief and commonplace kind of daily, verbal, behavioral, or environmental indignities, whether intentional or unintentional, that they really communicate derogatory or negative, prejudicial, prejudging kind of slights or insults. You'll see some examples here in front of you. I hopefully you can see those. First one is, so what are you? And the others that are here as well. One of the microaggressions I remember, I grew up in northeastern North Carolina, and I was in 4-H. Some of you may remember that or have experiences with that. My first overnight stay when I was 8 years old was at 4-H camp in the mountains of North Carolina, Wananoa. And I was probably one of 2 African-American kids at that camp. My first day there, the camp counselor looked at me. All of my siblings have hazel eyes, my sisters. And she looked at me and she said, are those really your eyes? And I was like, oh my gosh. So I'm reflecting on that. That was actually a microaggression. So I asked the question, how do you think microaggressions affect children and youth? And obviously they do in terms of some of these statements that are presented before us. So think about microaggressions as well. So to what we talked about so far today, let's look at this looser example here. And case studies and examples are a great way of learning and expressing and talking about the skills probably that you will acquire through this training as well. Luther is a 5-year-old African-American male adopted by a middle-class white couple with 2 children born to them, ages 8 and 12. Luther recently asked his adopted parents, why don't I look like you? Or Jenny and John. My skin is darker. Will it get lighter like yours? Where did I come from? He also asked whether or not they are his real parents. So this is a Luther scenario. So I have a question of you on the next slide. So in looking at these strategies, I'd like for you to take time to read through them. What strategy would not be recommended in terms of your suggestions to a parent working with Luther or responding to his questions? And this is a poll. having an open conversation, helping him feel safe in asking those questions, helping him learn to be colorblind, introduce Luther to social and cultural events, and help him maintain with birth or extended family. Stephanie, can you put up the poll very quickly here? Great. So if you would respond as to which of these is not, emphasis on not, a recommended strategy in terms of responding to Luther's question. And I'll give you a few seconds.
Remember, which is not helpful.
Not. Emphasize on not. Right. Almost all of you, 99%, responded, helping him learn to be colorblind. And yes, that is the correct response. We just spoke a lot about that and how that's actually detrimental. So we thank you for your responses on that. And others mentioned a couple of other items, but the response is helping him learn to be colorblind in terms of a strategy not to employ. So next slide, and thank you for your participation in that. So here's another strategy, and you'll see, and I need to close out my screen here. Wherever you see strategy listed on the slide, this is actually a strategy used in the training in module 4. So these are actually possible suggestions here. And Lisa, I'm going to transfer over to you. I know I'm moving ahead, but these are actually strategies, and Lisa will talk a little bit further about them.
Yeah, so these are things that we talk about in the NTI training, again. Having an open conversation with Luther's about his race and his birth parents, his family, talking with the whole family to address the situation. You know, what's going on? What's he asking? You know, I sometimes have clients in my private practice who are afraid to talk about things with their kids. If they're not asking about it, then I don't want to bring it up. Or, you know, I'll have to talk about it when they're older. It's really important to answer kids' questions at where they are, age appropriately, of course, but we want them to feel safe in asking the questions and also getting answers that are really, that are honest and open. Maybe helping him to maintain connections with birth or extended family in a safe way. There are ways to do that. Talking about diversity. People come in all colors, beliefs, religions, and how do we make sure that we are being respectful and honoring of everyone. So the other thing that we have in the NTI training is some role plays that we've done that help supervisors get an idea of how to have these conversations. If you are taking the training, if you're a supervisor, you'll have access to those videos. And I think they can be really, really helpful. And they were fun to do. And I'm sure you all have more ideas about how to talk with kids and families about race and diversity. So be thinking about that. And we're hoping that this sparks some conversation in your group, in your agency, in your organization. Another strategy would be to have a conversation about protective factors. How do we talk about this? What are the things that children need in order to feel safe and connected in their family? As a team, as an agency, talking about these things is really, as Edna mentioned, it's critical. It's not just important, it's critical, especially in where we are today, I think. Appreciating the diversity of a family, understanding what it means to be a multicultural family, helping families to convey this to extended family. One of the most difficult things in bringing up my kids was helping, trying to get my family to understand that we were now a multicultural family. We're not just all white. And attitudes and conversations and racial slurs not only are not appropriate in the greater community, in a global sense, but it really had an impact on how my kids saw themselves. So how do we really support and embrace those protective factors? This is another strategy. Thinking about a child on your caseload maybe, or in your practice, that's struggling with race and identity. What's their understanding? What's their understanding given their age? How do they make sense of it? And of course, this happens at different developmental stages. There are different developmental and cognitive capacities to understand race and ethnicity and how to experience it and what it means for a child. What are the things that are most pressing for the child? We might have an opinion, but perhaps what we're thinking is not what's really most present for the child at that time. And how can you work with the child and the parents to facilitate others' connection to others like her? I saw just briefly in the chat, somebody said the mirror. What mirror can we help them have so that they feel safe and connected? And again, you might have some other ideas about this. Certainly, what we're trying to do is create a conversation, start a conversation. Phew, Edna, it's 1:59. I think it's really time to talk about race. If ever there was a time, holy cow, this is it, right? We need to be talking about race, ethnicity, bias, discrimination, social justice, what's going on in our world. It can be very scary. I know it's scary for me, and I can only imagine what it feels like to my friends and colleagues and partners who are working in this field, what it feels like to be a person of color in this time. Our children and youth are not deaf and blind to what's happening. I've talked with a couple of families who said, well, he's only 8, he really doesn't understand what's going on in the news. Believe me, they hear it, they see it, it is omnipresent, we cannot get away from it. So we have to have open, honest, really hard conversations about our own bias, what it means to be a white person in this time, what it means to be a person of color, and how do we address all of these issues. Our kids and our families need the tools and strategies to have stability and healthy relationships. And we really think that NTI gives you a lot of tools, lots and lots of tools embedded into the training. There are many things, if you're a child welfare professional or a mental health professional working in this field, as you're going through the training, lots of resources to download, lots of tools, lots of strategies. Take it, please, use everything. You have permission to use anything there is in the training. We made sure that that was available to everybody. Go
Lisa,
ahead.
I love this comment, and I have to just bring it up. Why can't race and ethnicity and culture be acknowledged and celebrated in the first place? Instead, society is so divisive, especially in this climate. Also, most people have more in common among people different than themselves than that of people from the same or similar background. So very nicely put, and thank you for sharing that comment. And I agree that training has lots and lots of great resources. I don't know how many of you are familiar with NTI, and certainly we'll send you information about how to access it like today in terms of the training. And I think we want to emphasize again that training is free. So
free, really free. Yeah. We often get questions about how free it is and what's the catch. There is no catch. The training was funded by the Children's Bureau, and it was meant to be free and accessible by everyone in every state, tribe, and territory in the United States. We encourage you to take a look. It really is excellent training. As I said, lots of resources, lots of tools that you can just download and use as soon as you do it. So again, here's our website. There may have been questions. I was having trouble keeping up with the chat. They were coming in fast and furious. The training is free. We are going to send you, anybody who put a question or a comment in the chat box, we're going to try to address broad issues and specifics if we can, depending on how many there are. I will be sending an email, so look for an email from me, maynard@adoptionsupport.org, and take a look at our website. So many good resources. You can look at demos, you can look at our core competencies, the learning objectives, really an amazing amount of information on our website. Do we have our contact information on here, Edna? Let's see. Yes, we do. So please feel free to contact either one of us. We're happy to answer your questions. We're happy to help you get access to the training if you're having difficulty. Any way we can help you, this is our job. Edna and I are just so pleased to be able to present this to you and so pleased to be able to help you access this so that you can have the tools and strategies that you need to support permanency and well-being for children and families. Thank you so much for being part of our training. We look forward to hearing from you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.